Well, Shannon and that aren't here, but good evening, everybody. Obviously, we're up to chapter 4 on therapy of desire, Epicurean surgery. Um, Usually, we say just a couple of sentences about what we think about the text. Um, I kind of read this one in a real piecemeal way. I was kind of in a hurry this week, or time poor. But again, I really enjoyed it. But I must admit, I kept reading Epicurus and thinking, wow, a lot of these arguments were kind of, it's hard for me to kind of differentiate some of the Epicurean arguments from the Stoic ones in some respects. So that's interesting. It'd be interesting to pull them apart a little bit as we go along, perhaps. Yeah. What do you guys think?
Were you referring like to Epicurean texts that you have that you read the direct
Oh, no, I mean
text?
the description in the text about the practical method and
Oh
some of the
yeah, yeah, yeah,
therapeutic aspects
yeah.
of
It
it.
was, but I was amazed at how the model of the school was so much like a cult, and I hadn't realised the extent of how much he aggrandized himself to his followers, and she really brings that out, you know. Um, and because cults are always been of interest to me. So it was really quite intriguing to see, how opposite it was to the Aristotelian method, and the it was quite astounding. And I wondered really, you might know, Judith, Courtney, or Tom, what numbers were they processing through the school? Do you know? Like, I know it ran for hundreds of years, didn't it? It went for a very long time. But
yeah, that's a good question, Jodie. I don't have a feel for that, but I do know that by the time you've got Republican Rome, like, everyday kind of, well, not obviously the working people, but everyday middle class and upper class people would say, oh, yep, hi, Carl, would say, yep, I'm an Epicurean. They would be part of the movement, even though they were no longer kind of in attendance at the garden because that had ceased to be. So
right.
I'd say the numbers were huge, to be honest.
Yeah. Well, just from the he was certainly a very good promoter, self-promoter. Like, he distributed obviously many texts to the public. Obviously, that's probably why his work is so extant, because there was so much distribution of the work, because he really wanted everyone to read it. And then that story of the big stone.
Yeah, Diogenes of Oanander.
Yeah,
Just putting it out there for everybody to read.
On the road, like big, like board, like a big billboard. Like the first billboard.
That's right. Yeah,
Funny. Yeah,
but I think just to make a general comment on the chapter, I think Nussbaum's done something remarkable here. She's assembled all the kind of the surviving source texts, and so it's a bit hard to convey, but the main source text from antiquity is actually Lucretius, who's a Roman writing in the 1st century BCE. And when I say main, I mean that he provides the most of the volume of our sources. There are various fragmentary sources that are summarized in Diogenes Laertius. And also, Nussbaum also takes account of Philodemus, this later Epicurean whose writing survived at Rome. So I think she's done a remarkable thing to assemble all these Epicurean sources and to draw conclusions from them. So I think that was a remarkable effort of scholarship.
Yeah, interesting point too. Makes you wonder, I guess two things. One, how come much of Epicurus was lost? Was it just because the Christians weren't particularly interested in Epicurus?
Well, yeah, and well, not just that, but so you know, and again, reading this, I thought it was a bit of an irony. In antiquity, it was the Epicureans who were most associated with atomism, you know, the Democritean atomism, but also, and that was related, they were routinely denigrated because they didn't focus on virtue as much as the Platonists and the Stoics. So it's a great, so I would say that there being, you know, most of the material being lost was part of that, but also there's a great irony in that reading through this chapter, and Jody, your point to the cult is absolutely key here. What some of Epicurus's dicta to sound to me most like is the dicta of monastic Christianity. You know, forget your learning. What's important is how you live your life, and you know, in the Christian context, that was how you know your scriptures and how you follow God. So it seems to me that there was a great, you know, yet again, the Christians may have taken a precedent here from, ironically, the sect which was most associated with atheism and atomism. But we'll get to that.
I think that comparison was made by Bertrand Russell in his history of philosophy as well. That link between monasticism and the Epicurean garden as an example. So yeah, I'm pretty sure that's where I came across it, which made me think there were lots of gardens when I first read about Epicurus, but it was only ever one garden, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think that's right. And there's a famous passage in Cicero where he goes to Athens and goes looking for the garden. Oh, actually, no, he finished up, there was some kind of property arrangement where he finished up having some kind of role in managing the real estate that had been Epicurus's garden. So yeah, there was only one garden.
Excellent. Did anyone else have anything to say? Tom, Absorber? Take that as a no? No? Yep.
Maybe just the only thing I'd say from the very limited reading I've done so far is how much the social critique that was applied in the first chapter, in the first section, it could have just as easily, in fact, it still applies today. Everything was there. I was actually blown away by how similar the issues that he was picking out are to the same issues that we're facing today. It's probably obvious to everybody else on the call, but yeah, for me, I was really taken aback by just how yeah, there wasn't a need really to translate that critique. It still applies.
I think it's a great point, because it's something that struck me equally, was that, you know, I used to think, wow, it's amazing how we can still use Stoicism as a critique to today's problems. And then you read it and you realize, oh my God, well, no, that's where it came from. You know, even for Socrates and that, it was already an issue. So they were already, you know, critiquing society, because society seems to, you know, throw up spontaneously the same kind of issues of greed and attachment to external things, and what is the good life, and so on. And yeah, fascinating to know that we really haven't changed that much. I was going to ask just quickly before we move on, since Jody brought it up, about the idea of the cults, because obviously there were Pythagorean cults before this, and presumably mystery cults and the like. But is this the first? I wonder if this is one of the first cults. Well, it won't be the first, because again, Pythagoras. But one of the major cults that actually recommended people move away from civic life to go and live in this kind of dedicated garden. I was just curious about that, because that, you'd think that would be kind of disruptive, but I wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think there was an element of that in the Pythagorean movement, but yeah, I'm not really sure. I think this was kind of pretty disruptive, and I guess we'll get to that, sort of culturally disruptive in the context of Athens.
Yeah, and it segues anyway well into the first part. So it sort of starts out, if you don't mind, I've got some notes. I can read my first section notes out, and whoever else has got some notes can read the second section out if you like. So just to jump in, is comparing it to Aristotelian philosophy at the beginning, which assumes that the ordinary person's ethical beliefs are essentially healthy, but Epicurus sees these assumptions as naive. And I took a few pieces out of the text just to kind of explore. So when we look around, do we see calm, rational people whose beliefs about value are for the most part well-based and sound? No, we see people rushing around after money, fame, gastronomic luxuries, after passionate love. People are convinced by the culture itself that such things have far more value than in fact they have, writes Nussbaum. For the Epicureans, society is sick. It values money and luxury above the health of the soul, a society whose sick teachings about love and sex turn half of its members into possessions, both deified and hated, the other half into sadistic keepers. So there's a bit of a gender kind of thing going on there. Tormented by anxiety, a society that slaughters thousands, using ever more ingeniously devastating engines of war in order to escape its gnawing fear and vulnerability. We see a society, above all, whose every enterprise is poisoned by the fear of death, a fear that will not let its members taste any stable human joy, but turns them into the groveling slaves of corrupt religious teachers. There's an unconscious fear of death that Epicurus kind of is interested in critiquing. When questioned, Epicureans, they might when normal people are questioned, the mainstream folk, they might give answers that show fearlessness and optimism, but their frenetic activity betrays them. The fear of death is deeply planted within their hearts, an unseen goad prompting action, though the person himself is unaware of it, according to Lucretius. So this just gets us to the end of the first section. If the dialectic cannot even help, then who does it benefit? Clearly those who are already well off, those who have received paideia, a liberal education. So that's the summary of the last chapter that we talked about 2 weeks ago. By scrutinizing the values of the elite, it preserves the status quo and further worsens the condition of the excluded. So the critique of Aristotle goes, could such a philosophy be not only impotent, but actually callous, a tool of exploitation, and accomplice to misery? Did I miss anything there, or does anyone want to add anything to that? Say anything about that?
Just to underline that I think it was on the very first page, where there's a quote from, quote from Epicurus that's preserved apparently in Plutarch, near the very beginning there. And he says, and this is the nature of good, if one applies one's mind correctly and then stands firm, does not go walking about, peripate, chattering about the good in an empty fashion. So that's got to be a shot directly at Aristotle, and how Aristotle defines virtuous action in a very restrictive way, so that for Aristotle, a good action has to be done by the right kind of person, it has to be done at the right opportune time, and it has to be done in the right way and for the right reasons, which means it's almost impossible for anyone ever to do right. So it's incredibly restrictive and incredibly pedantically expressed. And I think that's got to be a critique directly of Aristotle's ethics there, right there.
Definitely. And
Yeah,
yep, sorry, you go, Tom.
Just because, I mean, I think it continues on to say, basically, if you're not part of that educated class, then you're not able to, essentially, the ethics doesn't really apply to you. And it seems this was more about actually making something that could apply to everybody.
Yeah, and throughout this particular chapter too, there's this opposition between the Aristotelian kind of philosophical method, which teaches those who've already received the benefits of having a good upbringing and a good education, but neglects perhaps those who miss out, who are less fortunate. versus, you know, a truly kind of what's the word? A broader use of the medical analogy to apply to every human being that might be in need of a remedy, basically, of treatment for their sick condition, which apparently is widespread. Aristotle seems to assume too that the so-called sickness that the medical analogy is supposed to treat is less widespread or is less severe, and that in general society is fairly good and not that particularly harmful. It's quite beneficial. There's truth in the common precepts that are taught to man. But yeah, obviously Epicurus disagrees with that assumption. Who wants to do part 2?
I'm happy to do part 2 if you like.
Sure, go for it.
Okay, so I'll go by the page numbers as well. Epicurus sees humans as trouble-driven creatures, vulnerable to pain and diseases, and pain is manageable, but the disturbance of the soul is worse. So the quote there is that as though they are buffeted as if by a violent tempest, and the causes of disturbance can be removed, which are false beliefs. So that's that really strong emphasis here on the false beliefs and the removal of false beliefs. And we see it in the process when she talks about it later, this constant hammering at the participants to change their beliefs. The boundless demands of desire allow no relief or satisfaction, and these desires are based on false beliefs. Remove the belief, remove the desire. And then there were 3 points made. Number one, this is page 105. So 1, separate the healthy, good desires from the sick, bad desires. And the second step was to realize and admit that bad desires are based on false beliefs. And then the third step, of course, is the modification of those beliefs. So the empty desires are versus natural desires. So we get that dichotomy of the empty desires versus natural, and they belong to our nature. So he said, Epicurus selects a creature who is reliable and uncorrupted, who is a reliable and uncorrupted witness of the good or flourishing life with healthy desires. Now that was different for Aristotle, because he felt it was a person of political wisdom and immersed in the social existence. And we see that, don't we, that his focus was, you know, improving society in a sense, along with the individual, but the focus was all you know, was very politically motivated. But so Epicurus refers, for his model, he refers, this is page 106 now, Epicurus refers to an uncorrupted child and also a healthy animal. We are human animals, and we find in Diogenes, Laertius, Sextus Empiricus, and Cicero that they talk then, the quotes are all there, talking about animal nature, the way animal babies, how they respond immediately after they're born. Animals well contented with pleasure fight against pain. Sextus Empiricus said the animals feels pain and pursues pleasure naturally without teaching. As Cicero said, every animal is, as soon as it is born, pursues pleasure and delights in it as the chief good, while it feels pain, while it's not yet perverted. So therefore, nature is the healthy, unimpeded condition versus a corrupt social teaching, which enslaves us as time goes by. So this is 107. So he starts talking about, you know, the things that take us over, the religious superstitions, the fear, the love stories, glorification of wealth and power. So we can see what should be true, what should be the true human good by considering the uncorrupted creature, so this child. the testimony of the senses and bodily feelings separated from teaching and belief.
So just to jump in there too, before we get too far ahead. Interesting how the Stoics pass out that difference, because obviously the natural animal, the uncorrupted child or whatever, that kind of creature, Epicurus thinks that they're attracted to pleasure through nature. It's just part of their constitution. But the Stoics are saying, at least in I think it's Cicero, when he uses Cato as the mouthpiece, he says that it's actually the being is driven towards restoring its constitution, and that pleasure is just an accidental side effect of that restoration of the constitution, and that there's this problematic association with pleasure with the actual restoring of one's constitution, which can confuse the developing animal to think that pleasure is the goal as opposed to developing its constitution, which obviously will go in the direction of morality and reason down the track.
Yeah, exactly. So the Stoics, the newborn. So to just take a step back, this kind of, it's called a cradle argument. So the argument to the uncorrupted baby is exploited by all kinds of belief systems. And so the Stoics would say, as you say, Courtney, it's the organism trying to preserve its own life. So the newborn is crying out for food. Now, it actually also gets pleasure from rest, but that's not the aim. The aim is preserving its own life. So there's a key difference between the Stoic and the Epicurean position, that the Epicureans say, oh, it's just seeking pleasure. And remember, quick quiz question, where have we seen a cradle argument from the Christian perspective in our reading?
Was it Augustine? I forgot.
It was Augustine who commented about two babies at the breast who were jealous of each other. So the cradle, and so he inferred from that there was this deep corruption in human nature. So cradle argument essentially can be used in a variety of circumstances to demonstrate whatever conclusion you want to show. So I just wanted to make that a general point.
And it's wonderful to how this idea of the way a baby responds to reward, for example, is something that the behaviorists will also pick up and find very interesting. And even in the psychoanalytic schools, through attachment theory and things like that, you get this interest in the infant and its and the way it learns whether such and such is a good thing or otherwise. It's very interesting. Perennial stuff here.
All right. Do you want me to keep going?
Oh, those
Anyone
three
else?
things too that you brought up. Those three things you brought up.
Yeah.
They seem to be especially interesting to Epicurus. Or is it just because of Lucretius? I'm not sure. But this idea of religious superstition that teach us fear of the gods and of death, love stories that complicate our natural sexual appetite, and conversations all around us glorifying wealth and power. So the three things that Epicurus is fairly against explicitly, and sees them as kind of I don't know, rampant or everywhere pretty much.
I thought it was very interesting, and it's a kind of a tribute to Cicero's skill as an interpreter, I guess. But here he gives arguments to Torquatus, the Epicurean representative, which are, really present the position in a really promising light. And it's easy to caricature the Epicurean position on a lot of things, but Cicero didn't do that. The words he puts into Torquatus's mouth are kind of compelling at some level. So I thought this was a very interesting quote here on page 107. So this is Torquatus, denies that there is need for argument, ratione, or dialectical reasoning, disputatione, to show that pleasure is to be pursued and pain avoided. He thinks these things are perceived by the senses, sentire, the way we perceive that fire is hot, that snow is white, that honey is sweet. So they're portrayed by the Epicureans as self-evident. There's no need for the intervention or the interpretive function of reason to intervene here. And that's a really interesting kind of perspective, and sort of on the surface intuitively attractive, because we all understand that pleasure is kind of fairly direct, pain is obviously direct. So this was obviously a key plank of the Epicurean position, and well interpreted by Cicero.
Yeah, Epicurus is very hard to ignore because of his, I guess it appears simple and intuitive, doesn't it? As opposed to the kind of hard work that comes with Aristotle and the Stoics and the like.
Yeah, okay. So page 108. So the epistemology of Epicurus, that the senses are reliable and error comes from belief. So that's exactly what you were just describing, Judith, from Torquatus. How do you say it? Anyway.
Torquatus.
Torquatus. Yeah. So yeah, and that society is sick and unreliable. But the uncorrupted creature uses its own unimpeded faculties. That creature sees no worth in empty desires, and with removal of pain and impediments, sees this as nature of the true good. So yes, we see that freedom from pain and disturbance is our own complete flourishing. Logic and mathematics have at best an instrumental value, so he doesn't see any other learning that doesn't come back to the necessary parts of his ethical system as being useful or necessary. Where am I? Ataraxia, yes. So that freedom from disturbance and anxiety in the soul and freedom from pain in the body are the uncorrupted creature's goals, and the continued undisturbed and unimpeded functioning of the whole creature. So Aristotle, he saw that unimpeded activity of the natural condition, unimpeded activity, oh, sorry, hang on. Hang on, let me keep going. Epicurus's view of reason is closely tied to bodily functions, awareness, and planning for bodily states. So he doesn't have that same emphasis on the high faculty of reasoning at the high level of the dialectical discussions of Aristotle. He sees it only purely to help the creature, the human, to survive in a way that is enough for them to only need their reasoning to the point where they can ethically improve themselves. So then, and do you want to say anything there about that fact that the
Sorry, which page were you on there, Jodie?
Oh, sorry. Whoops. 109. Whoops. I meant.
Okay, that's okay. Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah. So.
So that idea that that not necessarily they don't need that really high value of reason and argument that Aristotle or the other schools might have used. He seemed to want to dumb them down a bit to me. He seemed like he wanted to keep them compliant, and anyway, that was my feeling.
But I felt like,
sorry.
You go, Tom.
Sorry. Is it because he's trying not to be intellectual and to have something that is more available and accessible?
Yes.
And maybe that is more immediately appealing than some cerebral arguments?
I think so.
Yeah.
But I thought Nussbaum was a bit unclear about this too, because at times she makes the Epicurean argument seem like it's not very logically compelling or whatever, but then at other times she's like, well, he was really sophisticated in his arguments. So there's a bit of, it's not that clear to me anyway. And
Yeah.
What was I going to say? I forgot. I'm being interrupted by my children. You guys go.
Well, I just wanted to draw attention to, it's on page 111, and it's kind of, it's where maybe Epicurus is kind of running into a bit of a problem, because his focus is on the untutored person whose natural judgments are going to be infallible, perhaps. But on the other hand, the untutored person doesn't seem very good at identifying what his or her proper ends or activity should be and beliefs should be. So there's a fundamental problem here. So at the top of page 111, or near the top, she says, second, the uncorrupted creature, while capable of apprehending the ultimate end, is not very good at discovering instrumental means to it. So that kind of suggests that, well, maybe there is a bit more of a need for education than, you know, Epicurus was prepared to admit. And so, as she goes on to say, if Epicurus had been childlike, supposedly this kind of ideal, he would not have been happy on his deathbed. But he claims that despite the intensity of his pain, he does have a net balance of pleasure over pain, because he has managed to diminish his awareness of pain through joyful memories of philosophical conversations with friends. Thus, though an untutored child can apprehend the end correctly, the tutored adult is far more able to get the end.
And this is making a strong point of technique as well, isn't it? You know, you're talking about instrumental means, like the child, you know, naively goes about their life hoping things will go well, probably not even thinking about it. But this instrumental ends, is that referring to the idea of technique? Like memory is one of the techniques, for example, and confession is one of the techniques. And that's what Epicurus does really well, is he's a psychologist, and she even says he discovers the unconscious. So he's doing highly technical things in a way with his subjects, with his patients, in order to erase false belief from their, you know, deep down within their psyche kind of idea. But the other thing I was going to suggest is, you know, because you guys were talking about the lack of what's the word, complexity of his philosophical arguments or whatever, it's kind of referred to here, and it's the idea that there's a kind of fundamental pragmatism to Epicurus's work, that he doesn't really care so much about the argument as true or not true, but rather as a method of producing a kind of cure in the person. So it's all aimed at the practical end, the practical effect of banishing false beliefs and curing the patient. And that's quite different from the rational approach you find in the Stoics and in Aristotle, obviously.
Yeah, because on that page 111 still, that idea that the tutored use of reason will help the adult avoid these pains, so that avoidance of pain. And then the list is simple, isn't it? Food, drink, shelter, medical treatment, and friendships, and happy memories. I mean, that's about all we need. That's about it, you know.
Yeah, so that kind of that last paragraph on page 111, I think is really complex, and I'm happy to go on here if you like.
Yeah, sure.
Because so this division between natural desires and empty desires. So obviously humans, like other animals and even plants, have natural desires and needs for nutrition, reproduction. Really, that's probably about it. if you're at the very basic natural level. And everything else really is, in the Epicurean view, empty, kenos, or as he sometimes puts it, apparently kenos spoudon, empty striving, because they're infected with, and just moving on to the next page, with false beliefs about the value of the things desired. And then we also get this idea here about limits. Natural desires are readily satisfied with a small amount of food or drink or whatever, but unnatural or empty desires have no natural limit. That's an idea the Stoics are going to take over as well. And so as she illustrates, a simple meal is just as likely to satisfy your hunger as anything fancy. And there we get the the line that launched 1,000 memes. Send me a little pop of cheese, Epicurus writes to a friend. If I had $1 for every cheese Epicurus meme I've seen. So yes, simple foods like cheese are as good if you're hungry as anything more complex.
And the other one mentioned there too is that the natural desires will, the acceptance of mortality is easier, and where the empty desire is that wish for immortality. So then, and from that erupts all God, soul, religion, all of those other. But then he's got his own religion. He's sort of pushing against organized religion at the same time as setting himself up as anyway. Yeah.
I can see that Jodie was very much turned off when she found out Epicurus turned himself into a man god.
Yeah. Oh, well, we keep going. Do you want me to just keep going there, Judith, or do you want to keep going?
I'm happy to press on if that's all right.
Okay.
So as Nussbaum says, the relation, and so we get back to this cognitive element. The relationship between empty desire and false belief is very intimate. Epicurus holds that the belief is the basis and necessary condition of the desire. And that goes, as you mentioned, Jodie, to also the false beliefs about death, which affect a lot of people. And right at the end of page 113, interestingly, one of the fragments speaks of an elenkos, a refutation of inappropriate desire. So that's kind of a Socratic term. And I thought it was also interesting on page 114 that she points out that whereas Aristotle and the Stoics distinguish between emotions such as fear, anger, love, envy, gratitude, and appetites or impulses or instincts or hormai in the Greek, such as sexual desire, hunger, thirst, desire for warmth and shelter. But Epicurus's distinction cuts right across that. So he's got his distinction between the natural and the empty. Many appetites or impulses or hormai have a mental component, while many emotions have a close connection or bodily condition. And interestingly, she points out that there's an example from Philodemus, who's this later Epicurean that we have some fragments from, including, as I understand it, papyri, an example of natural anger apparently based on the, for the Epicureans, true belief that pain is bad. So that's really interesting and a great contrast to the Stoics. So at the end of page 114, and this was something that was going to come up a lot in Roman critiques, and we see it in Cicero, Roman critiques of Epicureanism. Epicurus was at pains to point out that when he talked about pleasure, he didn't mean nice meals, casual sex, alcohol, things like that. What he meant was, his definition of pleasure was sober reasoning, logismos, and conversation. But of course, critics would say, well, hang on, if you want to use the term pleasure, sorry, that's what people are going to think about food and sex. That's what it means in culture. You can't just redefine it. And Cicero does this. He complains about this. apparently, Epicurus was obviously aware that this was a bit of an issue, so that's why he tried to make that point. So, is there any comments people have on that?
Maybe not so much directly about the pleasure bit, but I found this interesting. The longings for erotic love are held to result from a belief-based corruption of sexual desire, which itself is easily satisfied. I think a lot of people would find that one a difficult kind of path to follow. Modern life, we really valorize erotic love, and here we're seeing it as a kind of fantasy, and what's really underneath it is the natural desire probably to have sex, and probably the actual erotic feelings are just social conditioning. At least that's how I read that. So I wonder, what do you think about that? Because I'm in a men's group, and they often talk about love, like, and how they struggle to really actualize their love in relationships. And obviously it's a different society, but it's interesting to come across these different perspectives that wouldn't be popular nowadays. I can't really imagine having a men's group where we sit around talking about erotic love as just a fantasy that's been kind of foisted upon us by the culture. No, we're all over erotic love.
Does it tie back at all to that talk about the what was pleasure or what was actually as a need for sustenance, or a need for what's required for either food or reproduction, and a pair bonding response of like a way to justify being with somebody for a period of time, which would actually, you know what? No, I've got the wrong train of thought. I'm curious actually what others did have to say. I thought I'd be interested to hear what others thought.
But I guess you're right. It's that empty natural distinction, perhaps, or that it's overinflated, right? Like maybe there's, I don't know, Judith, what do you think? Is it the idea that maybe you would have a certain kind of natural amount of desire for somebody, and this idea of erotic love that we have is an excessive or puffed up display of what is natural? I mean, that's the kind of thing he talks about a little bit when he's talking about food and the like, for example. I wonder, and obviously you get that feeling from this chapter that his garden wasn't full of, amorous kind of staring into each other's eyes and going on moonlit walks in the garden. There wasn't much of that going on by the sounds of it.
Yeah, that's right. And remember, there's another chapter where she goes into detail into Lucretius, again, the spokesman for the Epicurean position, on his fairly kind of brutal takedown of erotic love. So I think that was actually a key feature of Epicurean theory, that erotic love was essentially an empty fantasy. So, but I think this is another key difference with the Stoics, because for the Stoics, the natural desire for loving relationships and sex is necessary and sufficient to explain why people want to be in relationships, and so that then gets so for the Stoics those are natural relationships, whereas for the Epicureans they're empty and not necessary. So yeah, that's a kind of a key distinction in the worldview, and I guess it's down to us which of them we think is more plausible. But certainly the Epicurean idea that there were no natural relationships was very countercultural in Greek and Roman society. These incredibly family-based societies, to turn around and say, oh, actually that's not natural at all, must have been really weird and very very sort of It must have provoked a lot of reaction.
Do you think, that article you also posted about, that idea of parental love not being natural, as you was just saying now, but, we know that even in modern day, even Jung and, many other writers and thinkers have considered that maternal love is very strong, even if paternal love has sometimes been a little bit sort of not as committed. That mother love is quite a demonstrable and provable, instinctual and hormonal propensity to behaviour, which exhibits itself as love, showing love for the baby. So I don't, so maybe it's a gender thing there, that they were men talking about, what their, this is just me thinking here, that they were having their own male response to parenthood, possibly. I don't know.
Yeah, it's quite likely, I think, Jody, actually. I think for us, and I suppose I'm saying here for me, but I tend to think the Stoic position is far more readily reconcilable with an evolutionary position than than this Epicurean idea that somehow or other we all finish up having these relationships, none of which are actually natural, even the most basic ones of parent and child, or it really
cult.
seems.
Sorry.
Yeah, that's right. Absolutely. It's a cult thing.
And any good cult will tell you, no, we don't want any babies here. Thank you very much.
100%. I think you're spot on, Jody.
Yeah.
But I wonder if it captures individual physics too, because for the Stoics, clearly we're part of a larger body, and so as these kind of parts, we can't really call them parts, we're bound together in these kind of complex groups, that make up larger bodies, for example. So that makes a lot of sense, that we would be obligated and have duties to one another, and that require fulfillment in a kind of pious sense as well, like you're doing the work that kind of the God, if you like, gave you to do with as an allotment of your fate, for example. But in the Epicurean physics, it's all random. It's just swerving atoms. We're just individual particles, and whether we bump into each other is probably rather random. And that's kind of the notion behind this kind of relationship talk, at the very least. I mean, maybe I'm stretching it a little bit, but you know what I mean? It's not like we're bound together in this kind of meaningful way. It's just, all right, you have a sexual urge, you might as well gratify it, but don't go crazy, kind of thing, and don't call it something that it's not. And there's this idea here that she mentions that if Nikidian was to join the garden and she had family or children, maybe she would have to leave them behind. She'd have to leave them outside the garden.
That's it. That's what cults do. They tell you to leave your children and family behind.
Jody's very anti-cults, I can tell.
I'm not I'm not anti-cult. I'm not anti-cult. But I'm
super culty. I'm so convinced that Epicurus started a cult after reading this chapter again. The first time I was like, I'm a bit culty. Now I know a bit more about the dynamics of how cults work. And I'm like, this is pure culty. But his techniques sound really effective and great. So that's cool.
I mean, you can't ban cults. I'm not trying to, outlaw cults or anything, but they're not not an ideal, to me personally, not an ideal way to live your life. But
I mean, because this Epicurean system would be so wonderful without it. Like, it doesn't need to be a cult for it to work. You know what I mean? Like, they can still practice Epicureanism and just have their parents come visit on the weekend.
And
well, I was just going to say, Ashley, we did discuss that earlier.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. So, somebody asked about whether there were more than one garden, right? And I don't think there was. I think there was only one garden, the one in Athens. But on the other hand, there were Epicureans all over the Greek and Roman world. So, yeah, you're right. They could practice it anywhere, and they didn't have to be physically co-located with the cult.
Yeah, didn't that happen after he died? They all just branched off and started smaller communities. Anyway, sorry to interrupt.
That's good.
No, you're right. I was
Sorry,
just
I'm
going to
sorry I
say,
was late as
Yeah,
well.
go for it.
you're where you are, Ashley, is kind of echoey, and it sounds like you're in an echo chamber. Just couldn't help that, but
That's all right. I'm still busy. I can't really talk anyway. I'm just going to get back to it. Continue.
cool.
Okay, so I might just finish off this section if that's all right. So,
Yep.
And you know, corollary to the idea that what Epicurus thought he was talking about was pleasure was not necessarily, well, it definitely wasn't nice meals and sex. He said it was actually philosophizing, arguments or discussions with friends. That was the good life. And so he actually echoes Socrates in suggesting that nobody put off doing philosophy when he is young, nor slacken off in philosophy because of old age. For nobody is either too young or too old to secure the health of the soul. Sounds very Socratic, actually. And to say that the proper time for doing philosophy has not yet come or has already gone by is just like saying that the time for the flourishing life, eudaimonia, has not yet come or has already gone by. And so that leads into this medical model, this therapeutic project, which we explore further in the next section.
Very good. Shall I jump into the next section?
Yeah.
The medical analogy circumscribes Epicurean philosophy in a way that it does not for Aristotle. Arguments aimed at other ends will be called empty. He talks about the tetrapharmakos. She doesn't list them here, but I find the tetrapharmakos really interesting, and I think it's there's nothing to fear from God. There's nothing to fear in death. The pleasure is easy to get, basically, and the pain is endurable. Isn't that the four? I mean, I'm going off the top of my head here. Does that sound right? Nobody? No takers?
I meant to look it up before coming on and I forgot to.
I believe it. It's something like that. So basically,
That sounds about right.
And it's really
I
clever.
think
Sorry, yes,
Yeah,
Tom?
yeah, but that whole idea of no fear in God, no fear in death. But to me, when the chapter goes on and starts talking about the three methods of memory, what's the other one? The memory and the whatever, and then the telling on each other.
Confession.
You know, they were expected to tell on each other, and to be goaded and reprimanded and chastised and be, you know, called out in front of the others as being recalcitrant.
But we
you
saw
know.
that in Socrates, I remember, when we were reading was it Euthydemus? No, yes.
I didn't do it with you.
No, but what I wanted to say about tetrapharmakos, it is very neat because of its pithiness, right? Like, there's nothing to fear from the gods. If there were gods, why would they punish us? You know, this kind of idea. But it's more likely the gods are these aloof, kind of perfected creatures that aren't bothered whether we're having a good time or a bad time. So they're not going to interfere with us if you know, we get up to mischief or not. That kind of idea. And there's nothing to fear from death, because, you know, it'll be like what it was like before you were born. You know, you're just atoms. You're going to disintegrate, and you won't exist anymore. So there's nothing to worry about there. Pain's easy to endure, and I think the argument goes that we're so fortunate that pain has an end. You know, when it gets too bad, you die. That's the end of it. So you don't have to worry about that either. And the good is readily available, meaning the pleasure is readily available, because nature has made our natural desires easily obtainable, you know, that kind of idea. So just from those four basic ideas, it's beautiful in its simplicity. I think so anyway. Okay, so going on, Philodemus develops the analogy, comparing different kinds of argument to different kinds of medical procedure. It cites known writings of Epicurus as exemplary of various types of therapeutic logos. Then she talks about I don't know. I took way too many notes for some reason. Epicurus was regarded as a great savior. I think you talked about that, Jody. Compared to Heracles, there's some evidence for illusions or links to mystery religions. So that's interesting. Epicurean life is self-sufficient in the garden, not just economically, but spiritually. It has its own ordered structures of daily life, its own religion, its own replacements for familial, societal, and civic relationships. And then she starts to get into the schematic list, if you guys recall those 10 points that she wants to compare amongst the various Hellenistic schools to see how they fit with each other regarding the medical analogy. And the first one was the practical goal. So the arguments are towards eudaimonia. The arguments are to act as causes of good living. For Epicurus, every branch of philosophy should be assessed for its contribution to practice. If it makes none, it is empty and useless. Philosophy narrows to whatever serves the master art of living. It involves the complete removal of 2K, of vulnerability to events beyond our control from the pursuit of eudaimonia. And this is a topic I was talking to Judith about earlier that I'm very, very interested in. And there's a quote on 121 that I find very inspiring. He says, "I have gotten in ahead of you, O 2K, and I have built up my fortifications against all your stealthy attacks." It's a theme that I think is a very strong one in the Stoics. And I think the more that I'm interested in a Stoic therapy, the more I'm interested in this idea. And I often wonder, am I reading too much into it? But like Nussbaum, I think it's a very important element to these schools, this idea that 2K seems to represent the kind of external agency that can affect your life, whereas they're going to overcome all of the forces of chance, whether it be good fortune or misfortune. They become it becomes irrelevant to the good student of these schools, well, especially Stoicism and Epicureanism, because they locate within themselves, right? They become the only mover of themselves. They're their own internal cause. They're not affected by external causes on their character and things like that. I think that's just, to me, is really interesting. And it made me think of, what was the other day we were reading? Do you remember when we were reading Euthydemus? And we got stuck on that argument a little bit where he was saying, what is the best of things? And he gives this list, and he says, oh, we nearly forgot one. And they're like, well, what did we forget? And he says, we forgot good fortune. Surely good fortune is the best of things. And everyone agrees. And he says, but the man who has wisdom, right? The man who has wisdom has no need for good fortune, because wisdom is good fortune. And we're all like, what? Where did wisdom come from? But I think it's just like this. It's the same move. Instead of good fortune being 2K, like those external forces that can alter our agency, no, the wise man trumps it because he's self-directed. He commands himself in a very, he frees himself from all this contingency. Anyway, I just find it the most, I think it's really fascinating, that topic. Does anyone else find it as interesting as I obviously do?
Yeah, you're right, Courtney. And Seneca, for one, often uses this image of Fortuna in the Latin, and building up a fortification against her. And I think he often uses this military imagery. And of course, we also saw, in Boethius' constellation philosophy, Fortuna is key. She turns that wheel, and you have to be in a position to not be overthrown when the wheel inevitably turns. So yeah, this was a theme that was very powerful for a long time. But I thought, interestingly, on page 121, again, there's another really interesting quote from Cicero in the mouth of his Epicurean spokesman Torquatus, who's kind of defending Epicurus against this charge that he's anti-intellectual, basically. He seems to you lacking in education. The reason is that he thought no education worthy of that name unless it contributed to our training for happy life. Was he to occupy himself like Plato in music, geometry, arithmetic, and astronomy, which, starting from false premises, cannot be true, and which, even if they were true, would not help us live more pleasant and therefore better lives? Was he, I say, to study those arts and neglect the great art of living, which requires so much effort and is correspondingly so rewarding? So this is another statement, and, you know, a powerful one against traditional education.
That comment you're making about the wheel of samsara and the wheel of fortune, I think you could probably not maybe equate them, but there's obviously a similar idea there, I would think, between the wheel of samsara.
I think samsara is the cycle of rebirth. So,
well, it's more than that, though.
Is it? I don't know. Yeah.
I was thinking of it as the wheel of suffering. They talk about the end of suffering, because I don't have the same background as I don't have the Western philosophical background as strong, but I'm curious at just hearing things that kind of make a similarity sometimes with, like, you know, the end, like, you know, like the Four Noble Truths, and you mentioned before, like the Tetragrammaton, which is essentially, you know, suffering and the way out of suffering and the end of suffering. And it seems to have a similar overlap here. And then there was this mention of the wheel, Fortuna, like Ochoa assumes the wheel of fortune, and it's similar to the wheel of suffering. And I don't know if I'm not aware about the bridges that exist there or the commonalities that exist there, but I'm curious for those who are more well-read than I am about them.
Well, even in, I'm not deeply read, but I have done a lot of comparative religion reading, and I think there is a lot of similarities with a lot of the Eastern understandings and in the Hellenistics. I do. I think there's a lot of crossover. Anyway.
Well, the wheel of fortune is obviously this idea that if you rely on external things, and this might be where you see the crossover. I'm not familiar with Eastern spirituality, but basically at one moment you'll be on top because you've got everything you want. You know, you've got wealth, you've got power, you've got status, but things can upset the wheel because it's constantly turning, and especially, you know, because the world is always changing. But also those things that you call goods, if they're externals, they're not permanent, they're transitory. So one minute you have it and then the next you don't. And unfortunately, we crave stable goods in order to be happy. We need to have, if it's an unimpeded happiness, then we must kind of base our, whatever you want to call it, our pursuit of the good on things that are always available to us and that cannot be taken from us and that cannot enslave us, and so on and so forth.
Something in here that, like, if Epicurus is trying to eliminate the fear of gods from people, kind of makes sense that he would say, well, it's a waste of time to learn poetry and myths of the gods and these kinds of things.
Well, I see him as trying to replace the gods with himself. That's my own little take on it all. He's introducing a belief in them that you know, they had to wear his image, all of that stuff. That's so culty.
Well, at the Brisbane Stoics, I was thinking about having medallions made with my face on it, but you're making me feel a bit self-conscious, Toby.
You're walking in the footsteps of Epicurus.
Oh, we better keep going. Right. So point 2, value relativity. The cure must look desirable. He has to demonstrate that he delivers what is deepest and most central. Often the student had trouble accepting that their empty desires are in fact bad and may not in fact accept the therapeutic argument as an improvement on her condition. The doctor must present the condition of the student in language in a way that causes a great shudder and place the size of the illness before her eyes in an unavoidably clear way. I think this refers to that idea of the different kinds of medicine. Is that in this section? Does anyone recall about the harsh medicines?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, it's coming.
Yeah, we're getting to that.
We're getting to that.
Yes. Okay. So Epicurus' choice of the untutored human as a witness is normative, laden with particularly Epicurean values, and incompatible with Aristotle's, who would see the child as an example of incomplete life and reasoning. Aristotle sees in the child a love of distinction making, a reaching out for knowledge, whereas Epicurus sees only the desire for freedom from pain and disturbance. We see a more interested sense of inquiry from the subject in Aristotle. With Epicurus, you are there to be converted. So she's comparing them, obviously. Also for Aristotle, results in ethics must cohere with results in psychology, science, and metaphysics. Yeah. The physical theory of the Epicureans has a lot of internal elegance and some brilliant argumentation, but there seems to have been no attempt to test it against observed nature with an open mind in the Aristotelian way. And I guess this is the point where I thought there is a distinctly pragmatic approach to the truth here that serves the ethics first and foremost to secure a eudaimonic life, one free from pain and disturbance. And there was a point where I wondered if you could do that with Stoicism, but clearly that would resemble Epicureanism looking at this. Which is interesting, because then it means we have to take the principles in Stoicism not ever as a kind of pragmatism, but that they're taking the theory as at least the best account, right? What do you think, Judith? You have a questioning look on your face.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting in conjunction with her point that there doesn't seem to have been this testing against observed nature. As it happens, Lucretius is one of our most comprehensive witnesses and observers and describers of natural phenomena in antiquity. So in a sense, it's as if kind of natural science found its way into Epicureanism willy-nilly, you know, in one way or another. They may not have been keen to test their theories against observed reality, but as it happened, Epicureans were also observing and recording what was actually happening. So that was curious.
Yeah, and I thought that's what I thought about the way she puts this. I don't know, what do you call it? The naturalistic observations of the Epicureans. She's a bit wishy-washy about it. She sometimes make it sound like they didn't really put much effort into it, and then at other times it's kind of like, well, they're sophisticated and complex arguments. So it makes you wonder.
Go on.
I was just going to say, but obviously in the background there's this idea that if the observations were to challenge anything ataraxic, you know, then they would be discarded. There's this kind of idea that she's at least suggesting, right?
So what she's saying is they tried to make the theories pretty like solid, right? Like pretty tight, but only according to their own internal logic. So they still, I think she's saying she still put if Epicurus still put a lot of effort to making it as rational and as well to be argued for as possible. But then they just never had anyone there to show them their blind spots or anything like that, you know, because obviously they're a cult and they don't allow challenges or anything like that. It made sense to me what she was saying in that passage.
There was an interesting comment at the bottom of 124, towards the bottom of 124, where there's that we need no fear of gods or death, as we can prove the mortality of the soul. And I've written, I don't know why, so very value relative. I don't know why I wrote that. But anyway, but that idea of their science, you know, that they can prove the mortality of the soul, so that therefore that's why that it's justified that we do not need to fear the gods or death. So,
yeah, because the soul was a material substance
That's
made
right.
up of atoms, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And so just like the body, it would break down and just go off into mix with all the other atoms, presumably. So there's a consolation in that, isn't it? It's comforting to know that you're not going to get tortured in Tartarus, for example.
yeah.
Do you think with all of these schools, though, they're kind of, a lot of it was ultimately just a faith, right? If they're deriving their ethics from their metaphysics and epistemology and all this sort of thing, they're all bound up together. There's kind of a bit of a faith element involved anyway, right? Like how do they really prove? How do the Stoics prove that everything is the fire and all this kind of thing, right? It's the same thing, really. I'd say.
Mm.
You're the first person I've ever spoke to about philosophy in a nightclub or a gym or wherever you are, Ash.
Yeah, it's Jim. Yeah. Doesn't this actually say this in this book that for Socrates philosophy was? Oh no, that was Judith's talk. I'm just remembering.
That was me.
Yeah. I was just saying, where did I hear this recently? That philosophy is everywhere for Socrates.
That's
It's
right.
interesting to hear someone wax lyrical with with the disco beats in the background. I'm glad I joined.
It's hard to get those bench presses in though when you're breathing heavily over Epicurus. Number 3, Epicureans pride themselves on the responsiveness of the ethical arguments to particular cases and situations. Oh, this is the bit with the drugs. Some arguments, like some drugs are bitter and biting, some are gentle. He will be as gentle as he can possibly be in administering a cure, but he also has available harsher and stronger remedies. If the purge does not work the first time, he will repeat them again and again. And there's this kind of quote in here, or comment, Philodemus gives about opting for surgery, and the surgery is a reproof. And there's a report by one student as criticism that was felt as an aggressive invasion of personal dignity. And it makes you wonder what that amounts to, but it sounds like she says a kind of public exposure of weakness and bad thoughts. And there was a suggestion. I think he was giving it as a kind of an exaggeration about being flogged or whipped in public or something.
Yeah, but that could it wasn't really spelled out. Like you say, she's interpreted it possibly as public humiliation. It might not have been a flogging.
I was just imagining Jodi's cult where the leader oversteps a kind of line and flogs the dude.
Yeah, well, there's also the bit where he also says about that he might resort to a good old little bit of procreative sex. It does say that.
So the Greeks are very sensitive to shame, right? So isn't that what she's saying there? That if you got called out for being an idiot or making a bad whatever, that is kind of a shame?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. See, it's all built on shame and guilt and fear anyway. Like, that's what I mean. That is never rooted out or removed. There's always going to be an element of fear and shame and guilt, you know. So
and to be fair, and you're 100% right, Jodi, the medical insistence on the medical aspect, you know, really you're actually sick. That's kind of part of it as well. And so, yeah, there's a somewhat pathological aspect to the approach in this context.
Yeah, okay. I think my bandwidth is low, but that's all right. Do I have a small screen? You guys looking at me in tiny screen?
No, you're right. You're there. You're with us.
The arguments are not just suited to her concrete situation, they are fundamentally directed to her health as an individual. rather than to any communal end. So that's quite different than the Aristotelian. Fellow feeling and friendship are central, yet appear to be instrumental means to the health of the individual. Even marriage and family ties are discouraged. We talked about that. Number 5, the use of practical reasoning is merely instrumental. Suppose we had a special drug, she says, that could make us instantly forget all of our false beliefs while retaining the true. We have no reason to think that Epicurus would not have used it, provided that it did not impede the other instrumental functions of practical reason, such as the discovery of means to food and shelter. That's an interesting point.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's something that comes up in philosophy classes and the like, is people will say, if you could just take a pill and discover the truth, would you take it, or would you rather kind of do the hard yards and end up in this kind of aporia where you don't really know whether you know anything? Or I don't know. What's your particular stance on that, out of curiosity?
What, the blue pill or the red pill?
Yeah. Well, don't ask Ashley. He's in a gym at the moment training. He's about to unplug from the Matrix.
Yeah, the iron pill.
Okay. The Epicurean teacher, number 6, therefore gives the standard virtues of argument a purely instrumental role. So apparently, the role of epitomes and summaries. So they're the kind of, they're the other important techne that you were talking about, Jody, I think. Memorization, was it? Memorization.
Confession.
Confession.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is that where the Catholic confession came from, do you think, Judith, or the idea of confession?
I don't know. It's possible. But I think, as Courtney's pointed out, the idea of epitomes, summaries, curae doxa, you know, key principles, and the idea of memorization, that's also, that would have fed into Christian theory or Christian practice, I suppose, in terms of memorizing scripture. So it's kind of a short circuit, as she points out, short-circuiting learning, rather absorbing, internalizing these principles. And I think, is this where she says he invents the unconscious? Must be later.
Mm.
And it does make you wonder, doesn't it, like how the Socratics would view this idea of memory, Judith, because you know, there's that whole sequence in I can't remember, is it the Phaedo, where he's talking about Thoth, and he says Thoth shows him the written language, and then Thalmos says, no, that's really bad because it's going to damage people's memory.
It's the Phaedrus.
Phaedrus.
I mean, he rejects written texts for that reason, that it'll corrupt people's capacity to remember.
Even though people later write things down and go over and over and over and over until they can remember it like this, in a kind of instantaneous short circuit sort of way. So they're in a stressful situation, they don't have to stop and think about it, it's coded into them, sort of thing. It's still not ideal from a Socratic point of view, is it? Because it's like, I don't know, I'm curious because it's almost like these are words that someone's given you that you've inscribed kind of onto your soul, as opposed to you've shaped your soul through experience and through this hard work of gaining knowledge, kind of stuff.
It's a very common practice, isn't it, throughout the church and the monastery practice, and also through the Eastern religions, in the Buddhism, the different arms of Buddhism. There's a lot of stress on memory of scripture. Memory of scripture is a really big one in globally. And with the Islamic people, the same thing. They're very much encouraged, aren't they, to remember the verses and the texts.
I think also in Stoicism, right? They call it epilegein. Is that right? The ready at hand, the maxims.
Yeah.
So they're short and pithy sayings that spring to hand, you know, that you can deal with any situation rather than have to sit there and think of one on the spot, presumably.
Is there known if there was any like influence of Christianity on Epicurus? I mean, he lived at a time well after Jesus, and there'd already been emperors who were Christians at that time. So would that have had an influence at all in some of these common patterns, like you say, oh, this is common to Christianity? Maybe there were things there that could just be adopted from other systems of belief, because it seems like he had an all-encompassing one.
No, Epicurus was 300 years before Christ.
Yes, sorry.
Yeah. So, and even Lucretius, who was our major spokesman, he was like 40 or 50 years before Christ.
Yes.
So yeah, no, I think the influence
the other way
must have gone the other way.
So didn't a lot, I don't know if it's true or not, but like when they closed down those communities, they just turned them into monasteries. Like, oh, this is a great idea. Have people isolated so they can purely focus on their religion, either a philosophical religion or an Abrahamic religion, whatever. So that's another one, isn't it?
Well, it's not quite as simple, actually. So yeah, basically, paganism had its ups and downs after Constantine made Christianity the standard kind of religion of the empire. But yeah, that's a big story. We should do another time.
I look forward to your talk on it.
Okay, number.
Can I just say, Jodie and Ashley, thanks for coming the other day. It was great to have you.
Yeah, no worries.
It was lovely. Thank you. Yeah, it's good.
I was swanning around the Gold Coast, so sorry I couldn't make it. Number 8, in Aristotle's school, the student would have been encouraged to study a number of alternative positions.
Number 8. Did you skip number 7?
Sorry, yeah, sharp asymmetry of roles.
Yeah. Can I just quickly say though, at the end of number 6, just be quick, Lucretius, I've got the system. The system is a stronghold protected from all challenges. High degree of order and elaboration. Everyone gets the level they need. So it was a system that had, you know, enough levels in it of complexity and simplicity by the looks that they could use to tailor to each individual person if they had the time to diagnose each person. That's the impression you get, that they did try to reach an individual level of prescription, you know, of what they needed, and that it could be according to the person whether they needed a deep or shallow immersion in, you know, to change their belief. Anyway.
No, but that makes sense. Sorry to butt in, Judith.
Yeah,
it makes sense because if it is therapeutic, you could imagine like you've got a broad selection of people from across the population. Some are really bright, some are philosophical, some aren't. It'd be a bit like being a counselor now that requires people to have some sort of theory that you give them. It can't be too complicated, you know, otherwise you're going to lose a lot of people, aren't you? It has to be at different levels for different kinds of people, presumably.
I just wanted to comment on section 7. And yeah, this whole cult aspect, as you've already pointed out, this reverence paid to Epicurus. And in fact, at the end of that page, which is page 130, we read that Epicurus even has people paying proskunesis to him. Now, this was, again, my point earlier about how all of this was countercultural. Proskunesis was a very sensitive matter in culture, partly because Alexander the Great, when he'd gone to the East and had kind of adopted or absorbed or promoted or represented Eastern ways of practice, and one of those was prostration in front of him. You know, he had people prostrating in front of him. Now, and there was a lot of resistance to that and a lot of resentment among the Greeks, because that was not how Greek men related to each other. Greek men did not throw themselves on the ground in front of other Greek men. That might have been what decadent Easterners may have done, but from the Greek sort of sensibility, that was completely inappropriate for one Greek man to do to another. So for a Greek follower to fall at the feet and prostrate himself in front of Epicurus was very countercultural, and kind of, it must have been regarded as very sensitive and quite offensive in some quarters, I would say.
It's a very much a guru relationship, you know, complete surrender, you know. Mm.
That's interesting. I didn't know that.
And number 8 then, in Aristotle's school, the student would have been encouraged to study a number of alternative positions, examining their merits sympathetically using their critical faculties. But not so for the Epicurean, which was governed by the conviction that most available views are corrupting. Study of alternative views had the purpose of learning how to refute them only. One should avoid competing influences, just as in medicine. If you were to take different kinds of medicine, they might conflict with one another. And there's a quote there about fleeing from every form of paideia. Happy man, hoist sail and flee from every form of paideia. So these features of therapeutic argument lead to the establishment of certain practices, which we've discussed already: memorization, confession, and informing. And of memory, he says, it's very similar in some respects to the Stoic stuff. Practice these things and things similar to these night and day, saying them to yourself and someone similar to yourself. Memory is the student's way of taking the teachings inside himself so that it will become powerful and can help her in the confrontation with error. If they internalize the teaching, they will, like Menoikeus, never be disturbed, either awake or asleep. It's interesting because I think she mentions this, that even the examination of dreams could become kind of useful narrative material in diagnosing the illnesses of the patient, and that if we internalize these teachings, it will actually treat us here. So she says straight after that, this internal grasp of a system reaches down into the depths to get at the false beliefs that lie at the heart of disturbance far beneath the surface. Epicurus, in short, discovers the unconscious, so she said, which is really cool, right?
Yeah.
And most importantly, what follows is, she says, this view has large consequences for philosophical method from then on. And it must have, right? It's really important. If we are not transparent to ourselves, but are frequently motivated by beliefs we do not know we have, then the operations of dialectic do not go deep enough. Then comes the difficulty of discovering what the student really believes and desires. The solution is akin to psychoanalysis and the use of narrative. The teacher must make the student's symptom apparent by getting them to tell the story of their actions, thoughts, desires, even the dreams, so that he will be as well placed as the bodily doctor is to grasp the totality of their symptoms and to make an appropriate diagnosis. We find in the school the first record in the Greek philosophical tradition of an institution of confession or personal narrative. And this personal narrative, it sounds very similar, this confession, to what the Christians will later do, right? Philodemus concurs with his teacher in judging that Epicureans should become accusers of ourselves if we err in any respect.
In any respect.
And Epicureans, like some Freudians, she says, would even meet with friends and relatives who will help to shed light on the student's condition. So this idea of informing that you found interesting, Jody, going on in the community. And I did mention before, Judith, do you remember in the Euthydemus, where Socrates has this peculiar argument where he says it's right for a person to pay what's due. And in fact, we should kind of dob them in if they haven't. There's this kind of notion, and we brought it up and we made a joke about, like, oh yeah, it's Socrates' ideal kind of state. They're all dobbing on each other so they can have a justice done to their soul and pay back what is due.
That's right. Yeah, well, that's a kind of a justice model, whereas this is a medical model, but ultimately the method's the same, right?
Yeah.
And also it's to treat the soul, though.
Yeah, true. Yeah, the result's the same. Yeah, it's kind of, and when you look at it in this way, is the way Nussbaum's kind of sketched it, it really does look reminiscent of Freud in his early practice and the personality cult of the psychoanalysts. I mean, that's kind of what it looks like.
And it's very compelling stuff, because you can't help but see that if philosophy is going to deal with the beliefs and the emotions of the individual, then it does have a significant obstacle at hand, which is the fact that we just don't know ourselves and we can't access that material very readily. We need sophisticated techniques of some sort, what we call psychoanalysis or whatever, to be able to get into that sort of territory. And I mean, I'll put that to anybody who's studying spirituality of one form or another, or something like philosophy as a way of life, like Stoicism. Don't you find that you reach certain plateaus or obstacles in the way because there's an unconscious or something in the way? There's things that prevent you from making progress, and without a teacher or a guide or something, psychedelic drugs maybe, it's difficult to go further. Do you find that? It's an interesting question, I think.
So
But that whole thing of sorry, go on.
I was just reading yesterday, actually, that Freud wanted to see him. He wanted to be like the great liberator of humanity, and his role model since he was a child was Hannibal. He loved this. He had these kind of grandiose things of him being like a great man to humanity. So I think Epicurus is the same as well. He sees himself as the savior.
It's intriguing though, isn't it? Like the other statement there, the pupil must show, this is on 134. Oh, 133 actually. This is still on 133. The pupil must show him his failings without concealment, And it's up to any person, any individual, how much they release or give up, It's an interesting thing that I'm sure they would have worked out ways to break them down gently, maybe, but still, they would have been broken down.
Yeah, and I guess part of the question then is, obviously confession, and that becomes really important when the Christian kind of scene is in full bloom. But after that, because presumably philosophy became the handmaiden to theology for a long time, and then when we get, into Descartes and that, I guess, like the early modern period, you start having a different kind of philosophy as a result. So it no longer plays the same kind of role that it played now in Epicurus. It's doing something much more abstract, right? I don't know. Do you know what I mean? Like it becomes quite a different project. And now, like, we're looking at philosophy through, when you read Hadot, for example, and he's saying philosophy has become abstract. It no longer speaks to people's lives anymore. It's concerned only with extraordinarily abstract metaphysical or physical principles or whatever. But this was not the kind of thing these guys were interested in. All these Hellenistic schools are interested in deeply ethical and kind of ideas about how to live the good life, what the good life consists in, right?
Yeah, well, will we keep going though, just in terms of the time?
Oh yeah, sorry, Jody.
No, just curious. That we might. No, it's good. I love where you are at. It's great. But we've got a way to go though. And 134, can I just say quickly there that, I just exactly what I said. It's where we're up to in the text. She might be, Nikidian might be unwilling to divulge all. And, even if she wants to be in the community, like, she might not wish to give up her deepest and utmost experiences, fears, dreams, or whatever. And she has various sources of resistance and reticence. And then I find it gets dark. I find it gets a bit dark. She may not even be aware of what is most relevant to her cure, but then it lists, yeah. Okay, all right, I'll come. Okay, darling, I'll come. Sorry. Sorry, I'll just quickly say that from that page 134, it does just go quickly into how she's dealt with, and I just found that quite full on. Anyway, I've got to go. Sorry.
So just to your point, Courtney, about how things developed. So if you haven't read this book, which is Matthew Sharp and Michael Ewer, Philosophy is a Way of Life, they go through history and trace the history of philosophy as a way of life, as opposed to what later became university philosophy. So, your point, Courtney, is a very live one. And the question is still, well, where did that change happen? And to some extent, it may have happened around the end of the 18th century or whatever. But yes, at what point philosophy turned from a therapy and a way of life to a sort of an abstract pursuit in universities, that's a very live question, and something that scholars of philosophy as a way of life are still working on. So I would recommend that book. So Descartes is part of the, for Descartes, it was still part of philosophy as a way of life. And even if you go forward to someone like Rousseau in the 1770s and 80s, philosophy was still a way of life. The change somehow happened sometime after that. So that's kind of the question.
And definitely in Nietzsche, you see someone who's trying to bring it back, he's obviously seen what's going on around him as decadent, or amongst his other issues with philosophy and stuff. But yeah. All right, quickly, Part 4 was very short. Concerning
sorry, Courtney, Tom, did you want to say something with that? Or?
Oh, no, sorry. Was it just, did you say it was Pierre Hadot and Arnold Davidson? Was that the authors?
This one is Matthew Sharp and Michael Ewer, but I know they've also, you're right, Donald Davidson has translated Hadot as well, yes.
Yeah, it's a different book, Tom. It's easy to mix them up. But Matthew Sharp's an Australian, isn't he? Yeah. Concerning the problem of a therapy that requires an exhaustive investigation of the individual and how that might be of use to others far and wide. The epidemic nature of belief disease led the Epicurean, you guys already mentioned this, Diogenes of I can't say it, Onoander, to insist it required the construction of a single, non-specific and highly permanent logos. I love how she writes. She just means a big rock. The aid of this piece of writing goes out to many, it says. I have decided using this stoa to put out in public for all the drugs that will save them. Yes, very nice. I think that's all that was of relevance in that section. Did anyone want to say anything else about that short piece? It's your beloved stone, Jody.
Sorry. Oh, right. Was which page you on? Sorry.
136.
Oh, beautiful. Yes, thank you. And you were talking about this, and you were talking about the stone. Yeah, Diogenes of Oana.
No, actually, I was talking about a single, non-specific, highly permanent logos.
Right. All right. You better move on.
All right, number 5. Epicurus argues that Aristotle's dialectical commitments are callous. when there is another sort of philosophy available that can minister more broadly to human need. A compassionate philosophy will make itself over into whatever answers that are needed. However, Epicurus turns his back, selling philosophy and society short for the sake of preserving the ataraxia of a small group of individuals. Epicurus might argue that the judges are all corrupt and therefore will not listen to good philosophical argument, but he has not shown that the Aristotelian inclined judges, administrators, legislators, etc., have to be corrupt, that it must be so. And insofar as there is any hope of such an effect, it is surely important to attempt it. And I think that's a very good point, because Nussbaum's obviously making the point that is kind of in the modern sphere of academia, which she sort of is broadly linking with Aristotelian kind of education, if you like, that philosophers do work that trickles down to legislators and politicians and policymakers and stuff. And if it's managed correctly, it does affect the lives of those who may have missed out on the paideia, on that sort of educated life. And if that fails, it's not because the judges have to be corrupt. And this is what, you know, a lot of conspiracy people say, is like the whole thing's fucked because everyone's corrupt. Well, it doesn't have to be that way. We could actually try to improve conditions for people, you know, and try to weed out corruption and so on. We could make an effort to do something about it rather than complain incessantly about it. That's how I took that section. Do you guys think that that's fair?
It's very anti-Socratic, isn't it? That, you know, so Socrates saying that if someone can't change your mind, the burden is on you to show them better proof. That Epicurus is just like, they're all corrupt. It's not my fault. It's their fault. There's nothing you can do. It's like a resigned helplessness.
Yeah, I think you're right, Ashley, 100%. So just on the final section there at the end of page 139. So it was a really interesting quote from Arcesilaus, who was one of the heads of the Platonic Academy and one of the ones who took the academy in the more skeptical way. And somebody asked why people often change from other schools to the Epicurean school, but no Epicurean pupil ever moved to another school. And Arcesilaus said, because men can become eunuchs, but eunuchs never become men. And I take that to mean he considered that the Epicurean system basically deprived people of their vitality and their agency and their decision-making and their ability to reason for themselves, and that they couldn't come back from there. And that's a really interesting summary of what she's spent the last chapter in outlining. And in a sense, and she did refer to this at one point, I think, well, you know, the possibility is that someone like Nikidian, maybe who hasn't had a big background in reasoning prior to that, once she's experienced the Epicurean garden, may completely lose her ability to reason for herself. And that's a kind of a downside of the Epicurean system, that the people, as in a cult, as you pointed out, Jody, resign all their reasoning capacity to the leader. And they don't regain it afterwards. And that was a really interesting sidelight, I thought.
And I could just imagine him delivering that and then just dropping the microphone up. Because it's just gold. It's like the perfect roast. But you know,
it was funny.
Yeah, it is. But we see something similar too later on. I tried to read, was it Porphyry or Proclus? That one against the Christians. And the argument that goes throughout that is that the pagans are railing against this new Christian kind of cult that's arisen amongst the poor and amongst the merchants and all that, and they're calling it anti-intellectual and basically stupid, pretty much. And they have these very highfalutin intellectual arguments against it, or in defense of Neoplatonism or whatever. But you know, the cult eventually wins out because of its simplicity and its you know, its simple appeal to the ordinary everyday Joe who's been probably left behind and excluded, which is exactly the point that she's making. I don't know if she's singing about Christianity when she's making this point, but they're the people who did get left out, and they fall into the cult. They become interested in faith and things like that. It's appealing to the marginalized.
But this does help explain why all the philosophers all seem to ubiquitously hate on the Epicureans, even though they just say, "Oh, it's because they're hedonists," right? But it's like, it seems like there's more underneath the surface behind just disagreeing with their doctrines.
Yeah, 100%, Ashley. So mainly it was, well, yeah, they're hedonists, they're atomists, they don't believe in virtue, and they're anti-intellectual. Like, you know, yep, that's a lot of strikes against them. But at the same time, as we keep saying, you know, there were a lot of intelligent people went with it. So Cicero's great friend Atticus, that he corresponded with all his life and who was a great friend and supporter, he was an Epicurean. You know, he was a Roman businessman, but he was an Epicurean. So he's a Roman businessman, so he was embedded in Roman business relationships, but he subscribed to the Epicurean system. So, you know, it was on one level, and I think maybe Nussbaum's, I mean, in order to make a point, she's presented it as, at its most basic level, it could be interpreted as completely anti-intellectual and yeah, lowest common denominator cult situation. But on the other hand, it must have offered something to more sophisticated intellects as well. So we shouldn't neglect that aspect.
Yeah, and fundamentally, though, for at least how she delivers it, the therapeutic agenda is something that really stands out, that is obviously missed by Aristotle, that it can treat emotional distress and torment and things like that, and that society was failing to do so by instead terrifying people with what might happen in the afterlife and things like that. So it's really interesting. Any closing remarks? Do we, you know, I mean, I love the book. I think it's amazing. That's me. What about you guys?
I'd say this is the best chapter so far. I actually really like this chapter.
And I'll just comment on the fact that, you know, a lot of intelligent and lovely, nice, good people get absorbed into cults, and it's not it's not because the cults are necessarily evil. They do have a lot to offer, as Epicureanism had a lot to offer. We've just been discussing that very fact. They had a lot to offer, and there was a lot of very good arguments in their case of how to live and how to reach eudaimonia. So, you know, but even right through to modern day, you know, you can still see this gullibility in people to go and attach themselves to something that's bigger than themselves, and, you know, give over their agency to this bigger movement, you know. Anyway, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's right, Jody. If it's something that's offering solace from, you know, the issues of the world, they haven't changed much. That was the thing that kind of came through as well. It's the same types of issues that we're still facing today. And if you have a solution, well, it's still going to appeal because it's still the same types of humans.
Judith, what are your final thoughts?
Yeah, well, I really enjoyed your chapter. I thought it was a real tour de force. but I think Jodie's correct in identifying the cult aspects, and but as we find in one of the later chapters, as I remember, there's a lot more, particularly to Lucretius' presentation of the Epicurean position than this chapter might lead you to believe. So let's reserve judgment on Epicureanism as a way of life for now.
I haven't got there yet, Judith. I haven't read that far.
But that's right, Judith, isn't it? Because you mentioned Cicero's friend. He obviously wasn't acting like he was in a cult, was he? He wasn't locked up behind some garden doing
No,
weird
he was
stuff.
a very successful businessman with interests all around the Mediterranean, and quite an influential person in politics, even though a lot of Epicureans avoided kind of political engagement. But Atticus he knew everybody, and he was a friend of everybody, and certainly very involved in Roman society. So yeah, it wasn't necessarily it didn't necessarily remove people from normal life at all.
Yeah, and even modern cults don't either. You know, there's still always a lot of followers on the periphery, on the external as well. Yeah.
That's true. Brisbane Stoics has over 1,000 followers on the meetup, I think. Absorber, anything to say?
Yeah, I don't think it was unusual. You know, it wasn't the only, what would you say, socius?
Say what?
In those times, there were plenty of them. You know, societies, special societies there. And yeah, it was a retreat. It was a bit like, you know, someone goes on a Vipassana thing.
Oh, yeah, like the Vipassana thing. Yeah, okay, cool. Shannon?
There's that aspect of it, isn't there?
Yeah, like
Yeah.
I find with like reading the Epicureans, it's like, oh yeah, like there's definitely some things that I find very agreeable. But then when I hear about the historical, like the history, it's a bit like, oh, that's like as I just said, it's a bit culty. And like it also is, it's not just that, like it's also just how withdrawn it is. That's probably like the thing that I find a bit frustrating about it, where it's kind of like, if you, I've got mine type of thing. Like, let's just retreat into our little houses. You know, of course we need a few slaves, but otherwise leave the world behind. Yeah, there's just like nothing there. Like when you like, I don't find that common like in all the other ancient philosophers where there is this element, the difference with what they want to do, but there is sort of this active thing of like, oh, let you know, improvement and be involved with the world and that sort of thing, or at the least not actively going against it. And that's always the thing that's a bit like, it's a bit of a bitter taste.
But just on that, you know, Cicero makes his Epicurean spokesman Torquatus. Now, Torquatus was fully involved in Roman life, right? So he was no kind of, he wasn't skulking in the garden somewhere. He was out there basically taking part in all aspects of Roman life. So it didn't preclude an active lifestyle, even though rival schools would constantly charge the Epicureans with being isolated and essentially selfish, really.
All this talking about cults has got me thinking we could do a special topic on your favorite cult. We could present our favorite cults to each other down the track. That could be really interesting.
I would really enjoy that.
Let's do it.
Yeah, that'd be great. All right, no worries. Maybe that'll be the next one. Descartes will have to wait. All right, guys. Wonderful to see you all again. And I'll catch you next time for Lucretius. Bye-bye.
Well, next Saturday's Euthyphro.
Yeah, Euthyphro, but in
Yeah,
this one.
Yeah.
Therapy of Desire will be Lucretius. Yes, but Euthyphro next Saturday. This
Okay.
Saturday.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Good night,
you, guys.
everybody. Good to
Thanks,
see you.
everyone. Cheers. Bye.
All right, see ya. Yes for the cults. Bye bye.
Yeah.